He goes on to say here, in reality, the truth of God is known instinctively, for God has embedded this knowledge inside of every human heart. Opposition to truth cannot be excused on the basis of ignorance. You can't say, well, I just didn't know. Why? Because inside of you, your heart cries out for God. It goes on to say, opposition to truth cannot be excused on the basis of ignorance, because from the creation of the world, the invisible qualities of God's nature have been made visible, such as his eternal power and transcendence. He has made his wonderful attributes easily perceived, for seeing the visible makes us understand the invisible. We'll stop with that right there. It's the simplest thing in the world. Can you notice the presence of God somewhere? Anywhere? Can you find him? My rancher friend, he would call me at noon, just saved, finding God like crazy, not messed with any religion. And he would say, I've already seen 1,265 instances of God's grace this morning. I'm like, I can't even count that high. And he said, it's incredible. He said, I can't wait to see how many more I see this afternoon. Well, he lived on a ranch, which was what? God's world. He ran over a bunny rabbit with his huge tractor, a huge tractor that has air conditioning in it, so it's all enclosed and I forget how much it weighs. Ran over it, got out, it was flat as a pancake and dead. He scooped it up in his hat, put it in his hat, and with tears in his eyes, he said, God, he said, I get 45 minutes to come around here again as I go through the pasture. He said, change this bunny rabbit. When he came back around, it was sitting up perfectly in his hat. He got out of the vehicle, he went down and touched the tail, it just took off and ran into the woods. An instance of grace. One more instance of grace. He was experimenting with grace. So he went over to a sapling and broke it in half. He said, Grace, fix that by the time I come around. He came around, it was just as perfect as could be. There was no break in it at all. He said to me one day, he said, the greatest instance of grace I've ever seen, it's like a pebble in a pond. One instance of grace triggered many more instances of grace. He said, this is what I saw this morning. He said a bird of prey was way up into the sky. And he said it looked like it had maybe, a raccoon in its claws, much bigger than a squirrel. And he said that morning all the ponds for 2 days had frozen because it was so cold. Which means none of the animals or the little mice or whatever drinks water could get to the water because it was all frozen. He said this bird of prey is flying, and it flies right over the pond and drops from its talons, there's claws, drops what it had. And he said on the way down I recognized it was a big chunk of wood. It hit the ice 10 feet from the edge, and I watched in the next 5 minutes crack, 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 until there's a 30-foot space of water. And I stood there for an hour and watched all the animals come from all over the ranch down to get a drink. And he said one instance of grace triggered another instance of grace to another instance of grace. And he said in that moment, I was able to realize how real he is. He just wants companionship. And if you can't see him by your spirit, see him out of the eyes of your flesh and recognize his attributes in the things you can see. Because if you'll let him know how much you appreciate it, he'll start opening the eyes of your spirit until you see him everywhere. He's not made this difficult. The one thing we need in the body of Christ is confidence in the reality of God. That'll bring you right back. Oh, I had somebody get on the internet and they told me, well, I've been watching the birds and I've been watching the flowers, but that doesn't seem really great to me since I've got cancer in my body. And I wrote back and said, I guess you're not understanding what we're saying. To find him in the birds, to find him in the flowers, is to find him as the one who kills the cancer. If you can make a connection with him to the flower and realize it's him, then you can make a connection so simply to the God that heals cancer. It changes your perspective. You begin to relax and you start realizing how overwhelmingly we are victorious. Does anybody get anything tonight?